Hello and welcome to session 190 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we will be discussing Steven Pinker on the possible existential threat of artificial intelligence. Steven Pinker is a professor in the Department for Psychology at Harvard University and a very noted linguistic. This is in fact a podcast, an interview, a discussion between Steven Pinker and Stuart Russell, moderated by Lucas Perry, with the title Steven Pinker and Stuart Russell on the Foundations, Benefits and Possible Existential Threat of AI. So what we are talking about today is an excerpt from this podcast where we focus on why Steven Pinker is skeptical about AI safety. And that means we'll be looking at the last 40 minutes. And if you're going through the transcript, this is headed where Lucas Perry say that the other side to existential hope is existential risk. So, first off, all these things that Steven Pinker is saying are things that Stuart Russell has in theory been answering, because this is a debate. So why do we feel that there's a need to go further into this? I believe that there is, because of the structure. So if we see in the beginning, we'll see Steven Pinker make around 30 claims, and then Lucas Perry will say, Stuart Russell, what are your response to this? And then Stuart Russell will reply to the very last claim that Steven Pinker has, and maybe return to a few of the others, but basically just make his own long list of claims. And then a lot of claims are left unanswered. So what I'm trying to do here is to go through line by line everything that Steven Pinker say and try to give some kind of answer and commentary on everything here. Another thing we can see is that this goes two ways. In that, for instance, Rowan Shah says that he's frustrated that Steven Pinker is not responding to some of the claims that Stuart Russell is making. And so in this way, Steven Pinker could make the same complaint that they're just not answering each other's claims. So another thing, some background that I probably should say is to discuss the strawman fallacy, because this will come up quite a bit. Wikipedia says that this is when person one asserts a proposition and another person argues against a superficially similar proposition, as if that was an argument against the person one's true proposition. I'm not really fond of this. For instance, it says falsely here in Wikipedia. But the way this turns out in this particular is that Steven Pinker will say something like, people who are worried about AI safety often make, and then some kind of silly claim, and then he will argue that this silly claim is wrong, and he will have good arguments against this. But it doesn't actually say who precisely is making these claims. And that's, of course, a bit unfortunate. So what claims should you actually be discussing? Well, I think that most people in the AI safety community looks to the book Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom as the most thoroughly written, the canonical version of the dangers of a superintelligence. Another very obvious place to find claims would be in Stuart Russell's book, Human Compatible. We have just talked about that, and it's a very obvious thing to do. Some blame probably falls on Lucas Perry here, the host, because he doesn't ask Steven Pinker to comment on Stuart Russell's claim, but asks him in general question about whether existential risk is possible. And also, another disclaimer is that I'm not really examining Stuart Russell's claims, because he does say some things that I disagree with. I point out a few things, and here, for instance, he's making a rather contentious claim, and sometimes he seems to be like talking around what Steven Pinker is saying and answering different questions or something like that. But I won't really go into details about that. Instead, let's see what Steven Pinker actually says. The first part is about what is called a prosaic superintelligence. He starts out by saying, in many discussions of superintelligence inspired by the success of deep learning, we're sometimes asked to. So he's not pointing out a specific discussion, but just saying that some people say this. And this is superintelligence inspired by deep learning. That's often called a PROSAIC, artificial general intelligence, and that's something that's considered a possibility, but a reasonably remote one in general AI safety. And going beyond just human level and up to a superintelligence in a PROSAIC way is also something that is considered possibly even less. So the discussion that he is criticizing, Steven Pinker, is further one where the PROSAIC superintelligence is able to solve the problem of Middle East peace. So I've actually tried to search a bit, and I don't recall ever having seen such a discussion. So I would like a reference if one exists. And the problem with this, says Steven Pinker, is that if you want to do something like deep learning with this, then you need 60 million similar problems, and you need the correct answers in order to train a supervised learner. And that's obviously something you can't have. So there's probably an answer about what that deep learning can actually do, few shot learning and things like that. But in AI safety, we are mostly concerned about how something that is roughly a general intelligence that is roughly on the human level could become a superintelligence, classically through an intelligence explosion. And in this case, what you actually need to do is not to solve Middle East, but to try a lot of programs and see which one is better. And for this kind of thing, trying 60 million times, that sounds quite feasible. And of course, the hard thing is to generate 60 million good programs, and that's of course something we can't because we don't have AGI yet. But it's something that seems like it would be possible. Another problem Steven Pinker points out is that some of the discussions don't have enough details. In particular, he says that in a lot of discussions, you could replace the word superintelligence with magic or miracle, and the sentence would read the same. So he's a linguist, so he must know what he's talking about. So I tried to, take the best discussion, not just any discussion, but Nick Bostrom's, and see if it was actually possible to replace the word superintelligence. You can see I've tried to do it here, and actually you can't do that. So you probably can only do that in poor quality discussions. And further, some of the things that are missing is that the discussions don't talk about what does the intelligence consist of, and what's even a solution. So my general answer to this is that sure, there are bad discussions, and I think if you look at the worst 10% of discussions on climate change or immigration or something like that, then I'm sure you'll be really disappointed because there are probably a lot of bad discussions, and also a lot of discussions where precisely what counts as a solution to war in the Middle East isn't really that relevant. It is possible that I'm misinterpreting Steven Pinker here, where in the discussions where you replace superintelligence with magic, then he might actually be talking about that people overestimate the degree to which intelligence, and in particular superintelligence, could obtain goals in the real world. Like it can just do things by magic. So it's possible that's what he means, even though it's not really what he says. Then there is some talk about extrapolation. The concept of superintelligence is a dubious extrapolation of an unextrapolatable continuum, like human to animal or not so bright human to smart human. So obviously there are some continuums that cannot be extrapolated. If you try to go north, then eventually you will reach the North Pole. If you try to go slower, you will eventually stop. If you try to go faster than light, then so the concept of unextrapolatable continuums is sound. On the other hand, however, if you try to say that it's impossible to go faster than light, then you need to bring some kind of argument or evidence. And for intelligence, for instance, it's possible that there is like a ceiling, like you can at most get 200 IQ or something like that, and it might be that no conceivable intelligence could ever understand string theory. So in theory, this kind of argument could work, but there haven't really been any non-trivial candidates that have been proposed. So I think some more work needs to be done here. Further, Steven Pinker says that he don't believe in intelligence. It's maybe you could call it a non-realist position on intelligence. So you can't just compare a human and a squirrel and say the human is more intelligent, and you could imagine even more of that. So Stuart Russell has a direct answer to this one later. I guess I could make a democratic argument that most people would say that sure, it's possible to compare a squirrel and a human and say, well, the human is more intelligent. But there are also a few constructions that I believe are philosophically quite, well, if not bulletproof, then quite strong. So the first is speed superintelligence. If you could make a machine that could think like a human, which would be possible, at least in this formulation, then you could probably just make it run 1,000,000 times faster, and that would probably count as a superintelligence. You could also like build 1,000,000 of these machines. That would be a quantity superintelligence, to use Bostrom's wordage. And finally, there could be something like a quality superintelligence, which is probably what Steven Pinker is saying would not be possible. So is this possible? Well, you can try to extrapolate, and it seems like it would be possible. There are some ways of thinking that seem like they would be possible, like an optimal Bayesian reasoner, and there are some biological limitations to human brains, actually quite a lot of them, that a computer program might be able to get around. I think there's a good case that it's possible, and it's on Steven Pinker to explain why there would be some kind of ceiling to intelligence. So the first scenario of Steven Pinker divides AI safety scenarios into two, and the first is about will to power. And I'm just going to start out and say this is probably an example of a strawman, because this scenario is probably something that I have never seen anyone seriously consider this in the AI safety community. And the claim here is, as soon as you get an intelligent system, it will inevitably want to dominate and exploit. And I think it's a strawman, but I also think it's possible if you are building an AGI in some kind of evolutionary system, then I think it's possible you could get this, but not inevitable. And the analogy that Steven Pinker is saying is made is one between humans and animals, or conquistadors and natives. The reason why this is false is the orthogonality thesis. So I think that's rather interesting that he's familiar with the orthogonality thesis. So clearly Steven Pinker has studied this somewhat. And this orthogonality thesis is just a fancy schmancy way of referring to Hume's distinction between our goals and our intelligence. I'm not really sure that's true. In Superintelligence, where Nick Bostrom writes about the orthogonality thesis, he writes that the difference is that it does not depend on the Humean theory of motivation. I don't know really what that is. So what I would rather say is that the concept of intelligence and final goals, which is what the orthogonality thesis talk about, are a lot normatively thinner than reason and morality, right? Morality and final goals are not the same thing, to me at least. Then the other scenario that's being discussed, I've called it here basic AI drives. And Steven Pinker starts by saying, I know that there is an argument that says, again, he's not really referring to a specific argument, but just saying that it exists. And he phrases it like this: any intelligence has to maximize its own survivability at all costs. I think that is, he's obviously referring to Stephen Omohundro's basic AI drives, where Steve Omohundro explicitly claims that this is not something that will happen to any intelligence, and it will not happen at all costs. They are merely tendencies that will be present unless specifically counteracted. So this is a too strong statement of the claim. Steven Pinker counters that his iPhone doesn't seem like it maximizes its own survivability. A fun fact is actually it does. If it's at 0% battery, it will allow you to call 911. It will not allow you to play Angry Birds. It will just say, sorry, I can't allow you to do that. But the real answer to this is that the iPhone doesn't really count as an intelligence. This is something that is implemented by the programmers of the iPhone, and it's not something that the phone has done itself, because it's not intelligent enough to reprogram itself and do things like that. If it was programmed to refuse to do as it was told, then obviously we would not buy one. And I think here, Steven Pinker, talking about this kind of thing, it seems like he's not talking about the treacherous turn and takeover that is common in AI safety. He seems to be considering a rather different scenario. He also says this is the less common existential threat scenario, where actually this is the more common, especially compared to the will to power. But they don't really cut the world at the joints because no one talk about the first one anyway. I thought a bit about the philosophical implications of an AGI that is really powerless, like an iPhone. Would it try and take over? I think that would actually be an interesting thought to explore further, but that's not really something that Steven Pinker talks about. The next thing he talks about is the PAPERCLIP-MAXIMIZER, which he thought was a spoof, but apparently it was intended seriously. When it was introduced by Eliezer Yudkowsky, making a point about human values. So it was not intended as a prediction or something like that. Steven Pinker further claims that this is a self-refuting scenario. I don't think self-refuting can be used for that. If you say I am lying, then that's a self-refuting statement. But here he's probably saying that these scenarios are unrealistic or extrapolating incorrectly or something like that. Another argument against the PAPERCLIP-MAXIMIZER is that we don't need more efficient paperclip manufacturing than we already have. So that's obviously false, but I think also that's a poor way to engage with thought experiments. If you are presented with a trolley problem and you just say, oh, there are no trolleys where I live, then you're not really engaging with it. But here he has an interesting argument. Human bodies are a pretty crummy source of iron for paperclips. And there is a good counter-argument to this, and that is the entire point of a maximizer. A maximizer does not stop when there are only crummy sources left. A maximizer goes to the maximum and does not stop before that. There are some unsubtle scenarios that are considered. One is that we might give it and superintelligence the goal of curing cancer, and then it just conscripts us as guinea pigs, induces tumors in all of us. And later in the podcast, Stuart Russell accuses Steven Pinker of making strawman a lot of the arguments, and Steven Pinker replies as, no, this is actually an example that is from your book. And in particular, the designers of this superintelligence would be really idiotic to give the system control over the entire planet without any testing. So that's two parts, both control over the entire planet and without testing. So that's referring to that he's not talking about the treacherous turn and not talking about the takeover scenario. But this is also something that I commented on last year when we read Human Compatible. So let's see what I actually wrote. So I've copy-pasted in here from my presentation where I say that Stuart Russell is actually critical of these examples when he writes them in the book. He calls them unsubtle. And the reason why I don't like them is because they omit the takeover, and that's where the real intelligence is. So in total, I think if you only have read Stuart Russell's book, then I think this kind of misunderstanding is quite easy to make. And so Steven Pinker questions this, and I think that's a fair thing to do, because Stuart Russell isn't really clear here. So at least here, I think he has at least half right, that this is not a strawman, but there are many other strawmen presented. So then there's, going a bit back to the PAPERCLIP-MAXIMIZER, there's the problem of the single goal. Because the curing cancer and paperclips assume a single goal, but things we build right now always have multiple goals. No current artifact is designed with only one goal. And one of the obvious counter arguments to this is that the AIs that we make, like AlphaGo and AlphaZero, they have the goal of winning in Go or chess or whatever. So there are obviously examples of this, and quite obviously relevant. Steven Pinker goes even further and says this is a strawman. And that's, of course, a very surprising thing, because by definition, Stuart Russell cannot be a strawman to his own argument. That doesn't really work. You could say that he is not presenting his own argument optimally, but it can't be a strawman. And again, Steven Pinker says that any intelligent system would be idiotic to pursue only a single goal. So this kind of sounds like Steven Pinker might be seeing this as a paradox, maybe even self-refuting. I think it's false by the orthogonality thesis, which says that you can combine any level of intelligence with any goal. But I think I can see where Steven Pinker is coming from, because if you haven't studied artificial intelligence, if you don't look at it in a mathematical way, then things like balancing multiple objectives and making trade-offs between them and something like that seems like it's a reasonable deep part of intelligence. And unfortunately, it turns out if you try to write it down in a mathematical way, this is just a utility function and a ranking of futures, and this balancing multiple objectives turn out to be quite trivial. And here I think Stuart Russell should have approached this in a very, very different way. So I think he should instead have said that this sounds like it's really a big problem, but von Neumann, possibly the smartest person in the entire world, has looked at this and have proven a theory on von Neumann-Morgenstern utility, and this is actually something that is totally solved. So I think it's and it's unreasonable for Stuart Russell to just assume that Steven Pinker can understand this easily. The next topic is on real or perceived safety, where Stuart Russell says that nuclear power was an example where engineers were careless with safety and people got scared, and so the full potential was not realized. Steven Pinker counters that this is actually an irrational fear, and so the reaction to something like Chernobyl is precisely how we should not deal with the dangers facing humanity. So again, Steven Pinker is obviously right. Overreaction can have very substantial costs, but I think they're talking past each other in the way that Stuart Russell say we as engineers must be really careful with safety, and Steven Pinker says we as the public must not react irrational to this kind of failures. And I think that's they are writing for different audiences. Russell is talking to engineers, and Steven Pinker seems like he's trying to make the public more rational, writing books to the general audience. The next question is the question of small odds. Here again a direct quote. You could say, well, even if the odds are small, the damage would be so catastrophic that it is worth our concern. And that's the thing one could say. But Stuart Russell does not say this, and the general AI safety advocates don't say this. So here we are definitely going into a strawman territory. Further quote, the existential risk community and the so-called rationality community argues that since the expected utility of extinction is minus infinity, probabilities do not matter. And so, well, first of all, it's the rationalist community, not rationality community, but this is like a clear error, a mistake on Steven Pinker's side. This is not something that is being argued at all, and indeed people have argued strongly against this. Steven Pinker characterizes this as a moral hazard. I looked up on Wikipedia what precisely a moral hazard is, and a moral hazard is something different. A further argument by Steven Pinker is that we can't worry about every possibility. And at this point, Stuart Russell actually gets to make some kind of reply. All the rest of it has basically, up until this point, have been Steven Pinker talking uninterrupted. So finally, we get something that looks like a debate. And again, most of the previous points are mostly ignored. So, if we can't worry about every possibility, then Stuart Russell say we should worry about the things that we put effort into bringing about. And if we put hundreds of billions into AI, then this kind of things should be something where we should consider what would be the results of this. Steven Pinker further replies to this that money is pouring into AI, but not into super optimizers tasked with curing cancer and with the power to kidnap people. So obviously these don't exist, so I'm just going to pretend that Pinker said AGI. AGI is a subfield of AI. It's often called the goal of AI. It's trivially false that no money is spent on AGI. How much is spent on AGI? That's a good question. DeepMind, I believe, were bought for 1 billion. There was a count of 38 AGI projects, so I think probably billions, but I'm quite unsure about how much money is actually being spent on AGI. And that's of course also something that should be cause for concern, that we don't really know how much is being spent for AGI. Further, you could probably argue that a lot of the money that's being spent in AI that doesn't on the face of it have anything to do with AGI probably also have a derivative effect on AGI, make it higher prestige, or maybe some of it can be used, or so I could see some argument here that Stuart Russell is pushing the case when it says that we're putting hundreds of billions into AI, because the vast majority of this funding will not be relevant. Another case where we get a debate is on competition, where we recall that Steven Pinker says that intelligence. He didn't say it wasn't real, right? But Stuart Russell is answering like intelligence is indeed real, and the example he's using is that chimpanzees don't have much of a chance against humans. Steven Pinker answers that this assumes that the systems that are smarter than us will therefore be in competition with us. Stuart Russell answers with the example of a speed superintelligence, like an AI general that takes action much faster than us. So obviously they are talking past each other. But let's see precisely how they are talking past each other. So Stuart Russell is making the claim that AI control is hard because intelligence is real, and a superintelligence could be much smarter than us, be able to outsmart us. And then Steven Pinker replies that AI control doesn't actually matter because alignment will be easy. And then later Stuart Russell will say that actually alignment is hard and give some arguments for this. And Steven Pinker will then deflect back and say that, okay, alignment might be hard, but it's irrelevant because control is easy. So in this way, they're able to talk past each other continuously. Let's go back to the multiple goals and see what Stuart Russell is saying. First, Steven Pinker say that all these scare stories involve systems that are giving a single goal. Stuart Russell reacts somewhat aggressively and say this is a complete red herring. And I've talked a bit about von Neumann-Morgenstern utility, which is the reason why it is. And indeed, if they are equivalent single goals and multiple goals, then it makes sense to focus on the simple case where there is just a simple goal. Steven Pinker then makes the following statement. As you go down the tail of possible risks, you're going into potentially infinitesimal risks. And so I was quite uncertain about precisely what he's referring to here. Obviously, there are infinitely many possible single goals. Like you could maximize paperclips, you could maximize staplers, or combinations. So for this reason, each of them is infinitesimally small. But they can still be summed up in an obvious way, like if there's 10% risk of a single goal AI. So we don't get any Pascal's wager-like problems with infinitely small risks. Another quite interesting argument here was actually Stuart Russell claiming that on alignment, not control this time, that we have no clue about how to get within epsilon of the true human ranking over futures. And I imagine that a number of listeners were confused about this. So let me try to explain in more details what he's actually talking about. So, for instance, we have Jun Ku's work that we talked about 2 weeks ago, and that would be an example. So we do indeed have a clue about how to do this. And let's go with Jun Ku's proposal. So this is a graph here with an x and a y axis. And on the y-axis, our goal, we have the perfect human utility function, capital H. And let's say that a challenger gives us an epsilon and say, you have to get within 1% of the true human utility function. So that will be an epsilon of 0.01. If you need to do that, then you need to Junku's work say that you can get the precise human utility function if you have a perfect world model. But if you want to just get into within epsilon, then you don't actually need a perfect world model. You can just have a world model that is a delta from the perfect world model. So maybe 95% correct or something like that. So the way this works is that if you need to be 1% from the true human utility function, then you need a world model that is then maybe 5% from the true one. And if you need a better approximation, then you also need a better world model. But this is the kind of epsilon delta kind of proof that Stuart Russell is talking about when he says we need to get within epsilon. Steven Pinker replies that even if there isn't an epsilon, that we can't, it's a really convoluted sentence here. There's a double negation, and when I try to parse it formally, he has misspoken something. It doesn't make sense. So let me try to explain what I think Steven Pinker is actually saying. That even if we can't eliminate all AI risk, we can eliminate risks from just naive happiness optimizers. And to make it even more simple, you can say that we can do better on alignment than just maximizing happiness. And that's true, we probably can do that, but it will probably still be catastrophically poorly. And that's the distinction of tools and agents. I'm paraphrasing Steven Pinker a bit here. And he says that building an AGI is a difficult problem if the AI is optimizing both either some single or small list of generic goals. I could answer that this is like the AI is doing now, but note that Pinker is moving towards accepting multiple goals as roughly the same. And also, it's difficult if we're using a ranking over possible futures, which almost all conceivable AIs do, which we know because of the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility theorem. And it's also difficult if the AI is empowered to pursue these objectives by any means, and that's of course the thing that is not required because of the treacherous turn and the takeover. Instead, Steven Pinker suggests that we should build tools that solve specific problems. That's something that the AI safety community has discussed a lot under the heading of tool AI. And I think one of the best counter-arguments to this would be written by Gern, saying that with the title, Tool AIs want to be agent AIs. Further, Steven Pinker is saying that superintelligence might be hard. We can't take into account the fantastically chaotic and unpredictable reaction of humans. Humans might actually not be that chaotic and unpredictable. Economics is built on predicting what humans will in aggregate do. And this complexity of humans both make it hard to predict all conceivable failures of AI control. And that might be true, actually, but that's really an argument for AI safety work, right? If it's hard to predict all the ways that a plane can crash, well, then you should probably work hard on making the plane safe. But it also makes it hard to achieve superintelligence. Is that actually true? Well, the main way I think about obtaining superintelligence is through recursive self-improvement as part of a intelligence explosion. And there are no humans involved in this at all. So that doesn't seem like it. Perhaps what he means is that because humans are so chaotic and unpredictable, then a superintelligence might only be of limited power, in that even the smartest person can't predict the stock market. Obviously, he can't predict cultural developments in 1 year. And it's possible that a superintelligence might be much smarter than the smartest person ever and still be unable to predict cultural developments in 1 year. It's also possible that if there are no correlation between human intelligence, then building a superintelligence might be very difficult, in the sense that if it doesn't compress down to a single factor, then you might, in order to be smarter than everyone, you need to have like smarter than 8 billion brains. That could also be what he's meaning, but I'm unsure. I'm attempting a steelman here, and I'm not really succeeding. I don't really understand what Steven Pinker is claiming here. Stuart Russell has another example here. You can view the fossil fuel industry as an AI system, maximizing a poorly designed objective, and which has outwitted the rest of the human race. Steven Pinker has a counter-argument. Just people like energy, and fossil fuel is where the energy is, and there are no countering the externalities. Scott Alexander has also talked about things that are not super intelligent, and has also said that we should be very careful about seeing corporations as super intelligence. And I agree with Pinker here and against Stuart Russell, because outwitted, the people in the fossil fuel and the consumers are just naively following their incentives. So it doesn't really count as outwitted in my book. Finally, Steven Pinker says that we might be worrying about the wrong trends here, because Steven Pinker in general agrees with AI safety in the limited sense that if we can foresee the risks, we should attempt to mitigate them. But we need to calibrate that against both what we know and a general level of ignorance. And he gives some examples of damage that has been done because we feared the wrong things, we worried about the wrong trends. The first is running out of petroleum. I'm not really sure that strongly counts as a realized hazard, because we expected in the 70s that we would run out of petroleum, and so the main thing we did was to reduce consumption, and it turned out that there were plenty of gasoline, but it's not like we are really sorry that we tried to make more fuel-efficient cars. The second is overpopulation. Again, there were a lot of people back in the 70s worrying that we would soon be 100 billion people in the world, and so the things that they did was like improving healthcare and political reform and things like that. There were both positive and negative things, but it doesn't really sound to me like this was strongly a hazard. And finally, genetically modified organisms, and that's been banned mostly, and mostly been banned because people are afraid of it rather than seeing this as a trend. So I'm not really sure these examples hold, but it seems like Steven Pinker is in general, in favor of safety, and he is mistaken on a lot of the arguments, sure, but I think in general, in principle, he would not be opposed to AI safety. That's at least my general take on this. That is all for tonight. Thank you, and see you next week.